would say the virtual stage is yours. Take us on a trip.
Okay. So I see the people are still coming. So again, I'm very happy for this invitation to talk to you. I apologize that my flight was cancelled at night tonight and I couldn't actually be there. But I'm glad that we have technology to somehow compensate for that. So as you know, I'm a professor at Yale University and I'm working on neural networks for many, many years. I'm a physicist by training, and a lot of what I do is inspired and influenced by both physics and information theory. And I really encourage you to, as promised, to interact with me. So I really want to be able to see you and hear you if you have questions. Now I don't hear anything from you, but once you have questions, then So I'm moving to my talk. So essentially, this is the work done with two of my students, Nobel Zaslavsky and Rovich Ziv, and a few others who are joining us, which received quite a lot of attention in the last year. All the actual papers with all the details are not yet out, unfortunately, but it was still remarkably influential already. So as you know, deep learning has this long history of starting already in the 50s with the idea of the McCulloch-Pitts neuron, and then proposed essentially by Rosenblatt in the 60s as a multi-layer perceptron and the perceptron algorithm. But he couldn't tell us how to train the lower layers, and this was dismissed essentially as a useful thing by Minsky and Papert in the late 60s, early 70s, and essentially came back again only in the 80s through the idea of the error backpropagation by a bunch of psychologists, actually, Runelhardt, Hinton, and others, who were essentially proposing they couldn't take the work of Minsky and Papert seriously, and were proposing using backpropagation just by taking the derivatives through a smooth version of the units. And this is what we call now essentially just the chain rule of derivatives. And this seemed to work quite well. And of course, for shallow neural networks in the 80s, they started to show signs of doing interesting things. But then came Batnik essentially in the end of the 80s to the US and introduced his support vector machines and kernel methods, which took over this field, the field of machine learning for about 10 years. Sometimes I heard already that some people call this 10 years the winter of the AI, but I don't know. It's actually, we actually learned quite a lot during this time about the rigorous statements. But again, at this level of machine learning, it was mainly curve fitting in a very sophisticated way, in high dimensions, but it was curve fitting, which means that the size of the parameter space or the dimensionality of the hypothesis class was at the order of magnitude of the number of points. In the late 2000s, from 2008 or even earlier, Hinton, together with several other people, and Jan LeCun and a few others, introduced this deep version of neural network, which essentially is many, many layers, much more than 3, 4, 5, which was originally considered unnecessary because there are theorems that with even one hidden layer you can actually implement any function, but we also knew that this is completely infeasible computationally because then the number of the size of this hidden layer has to be exponential in the output, in the input side, sorry. But eventually those multi-layer, many-layer systems took over, and in the late 2000s, and since then they really completely dominated the field by first winning all the competitions in vision and later on in speech, and then in things like control. And of course, the late version of it was things like reinforcement learning or deep reinforcement learning with all sorts of tricks of weight decay and dropouts and regularization process. And of course, they're all using more or less on a standard basis convolution neural networks with various nonlinearities, but the main structure remained the same, many, many layers of feed-forward connections with some skip or backward connection in the form of resonance, for example. But so I'm interested here in what I call simple neural networks, which is really just this feed-forward and no resonates or any reconstruction terms like that we see in some of those newer versions of networking. I can discuss them later if you want how they fit into our picture, but initially I'm not talking about it. And I'm also not talking about things like generative models or like, autoencoders or many other versions of deep reinforcement learning which essentially has feedback in them. We want first to understand the plain vanilla, fully connected neural network and see what's going on there. And later on, like any good theory, it has to start from the simple things, and then we can treat maybe the more complicated things. But the fact is that those machines, those essentially universal type of machine learning devices, can tackle many different type of problems very successfully. Essentially, all the classical problem of AI, although not everything. There are some even very easy problems that seem to be very hard for deep neural networks. And one of the questions we want to answer is indeed what are the functions, what are the problems for which deep neural networks work well and why they work so well. So as I said already, I believe that we are beginning. It's not only us. It's the community is beginning to develop some understanding after about 10 years of not understanding what's going in deep learning. We were surprised, like everyone, that it works so well, but there was no clear understanding why it works so well, and in what sense we can actually open this black box and this black box. And what I'm saying, what I'm suggesting actually has three different components or ingredients which are very different in style and in the mathematics required to understand them, and that's why I'm always losing parts of my audience. So please interrupt these questions, even though I don't hear you and I don't see you, so somebody will have to...
We are fine.
To interrupt. Okay, so there are three ingredients to the theory. One is essentially some sort of rethinking statistical learning theory, and I assume that most of you know something about the classical learning theory, which is based on what we call worst case PAC, or probably approximately correct bound, that started from the work of Valiant in the 80s, which essentially gives you very elegant and apparently powerful bounds on the complexity, on the error, the generalization error, out of training error in the worst case. And I'll come back to these bounds. What I argue, because I'm not the only one who is saying that these type of bounds don't work or don't work at all for deep learning. They simply don't give anything reasonable in terms of the number of examples, the number of parameters. At least when you think about them just as every weight, every adjustable weight as a parameter of the model, is way too high, no matter how you exactly estimate the dimensionality of this class, to explain the performance of deep neural networks as we understand them. So I suggest to go back to something we actually started to do in the 80s under the title of statistical mechanics of learning, to think about large problems again, and in the typical behavior, not in the worst case behavior, and to have data-dependent bounds between problem-dependent bounds, but architecture-independent or architecture-free bounds. So this is a complete twist or shift in the emphasis of the theory from worst case to typical, and from problem-independent to problem or data-dependent bounds, but as much as possible independent of the architecture, if you want, of the hypothesis class. And this is a rather big change in our understanding of learning theory on its own. And what I want to say, instead of talking about the exclusivity of the hypothesis class complexity, we should talk about the data or the input class, the input itself, or the rule itself. Although usually we don't know it, but we know that it's going to converge to something which depends on the rule. And I call these things, this type of bounds, the input compression bounds. Now, because the main difference between deep learning in the 2000 and neural networks of the 80s is in the scale of the problem. I mean, we went from a few hundred pixels to megapixels or even more in images and mega bits of information in speech or whatever, the whole size of the problem grew up significantly. So we're talking about large-scale learning, and large-scale has its own advantages, actually. We can focus on what we call typical patterns or typical problems. And the typical behavior is something which anybody who ever worked in either information theory or statistical physics know that when the problem becomes very large, some things become actually very simple. And I actually argue that for large problems, everything depends on much fewer numbers than what you see in big problems. And these are some sort of, and this can be captured by mutual information values. And actually these large problems give us information values which tend to concentrate, as happens in information theory all the time. And this concentration eventually dominates the problem. Moreover, we know that those problems are in no way identifiable. There are many different equivalently good solutions. So we cannot really talk about finding the right parameters. This really doesn't make sense. There are exponentially many, actually continuous manifolds in this high-dimensional space of the parameters of optimal solutions. So finding the right parameters of the model doesn't make sense for such big models. It's just like asking what is the exact configuration of the molecules in a glass of coffee. When I give you one, do you actually need to know it in any sense in order to drink the coffee? Of course not. So the properties that we're talking about are in some sense macroscopic properties, the properties that behave, they gather together ensembles of different systems that have the same macroscopic properties, but are very different microscopically. I'm sorry, I have some phone here, which... I wish I could know. Anyway, so the third ingredient of this story is the interesting correspondence between the stochastic dynamics of the training, what we call stochastic gradient descent, which is essentially this idea that was born for computational reasons, that instead of calculating the full gradient of the training error with respect to the weights, and then back-propagate it through the derivatives, we actually calculate a noisy version of the gradient by calculating the gradient on mini-batches, which are small groups of randomly selected examples. And what I actually argue that, surprisingly, the advantage of this gradients, of these noisy gradients, is not to escape local minima, which is essentially not a problem in high dimension. There are hardly any truly isolated local minima, and if there are, they are very narrow, they are not very important. But something else which is really compressing the representation. So something in the noise of these gradients is pushing the distribution of the weights to what we call maximum entropy distribution. It's not really maximum entropy distribution, very similar to the classical Gibbs and this mechanism of pushing the distribution to maximum entropy is essentially responsible for this compression. And this is something I want to explain much more carefully. So we argue, and this is still work in progress in many ways, that we can prove several quite striking results. One of them is really the optimality, which is that the layers of the network converge to what I call the finite sample information bottleneck bound, which means that eventually if you wait long enough, and for the dynamics does depend on the architecture, but if the architecture is sufficiently expressive, sufficiently rich, you're eventually going to converge to an architecture independent bound, which is optimal in the sense that no algorithm or no alien being or whatever you want is able to do better with this data on this problem. And as I said, this achieves some sort of an optimal sample complexity accuracy trade-off. And the diffusion, the noise of the stochastic gradient descent is responsible for this optimization, which can be expressed or can be understood as some sort of forgetting of the irrelevant details. And I understand that. And then, of course, once we understand this mechanism of diffusion, it gives us some other understanding, which is quite interesting, about the benefit of the hidden layer I mean, why is it that more layers actually converge faster? And the more interesting and the more sophisticated part of the theory is that it gives us some new interpretability of the layers. It actually tells us what the layers represent, and in some sense, if we understand the problem, or understand some properties of the problem, for example, if there is symmetry in the data, let's say translation symmetry or rotation symmetry or anything like this, then we can say quite a lot about what the layers are going to where are going to land. Not sure how much of this part of the theory we're going to get into. It's a little more advanced in the sense that I need some sort of group theory and maybe some other mechanism, but if there are questions, I'll get into that as well. So essentially, now I just want to emphasize that this work, since we exposed it last year, it's almost a year from now, that last June that I gave this talk in Berlin, it became quite viral to some extent. A lot of texts on this theory have been made, and I of course, some of them are actually very interesting and require a lot of thinking. So I just want to briefly mention that I'm not ignoring any of these things. Some of them are really very important. So for example, we were attacked on the way we estimate information. So this is a red herring in the sense that it really doesn't matter. I mean, we don't need to estimate information for anything. It's not required for the training. We did it only as an illustration of the value of information. We can actually prove rigorously that information is compressed by stochastic gradient descent if there is enough variability in the data. And we just illustrated this compression by estimating information. So this is partly mentioned in this paper by the Harvard people, the Sachs et al., and which I think is simply flawed in many ways. For example, they argue that we don't see compression in values. I think this is wrong. We need to estimate this information correctly. Now, the interesting part of the criticism that we get is in papers that appears in last ICLR, about really the interesting things are ResNets and RevNets and iRevNets, which are all those networks which are forced not to compress by essentially forcing or turning the map from layer to layer to be completely reversible. And this is an interesting challenge for us because if you don't need to compress, then but we never said that compression is necessary. We just said that this is sufficient. So the fact that you can have networks that are trained without compression and still generalize well is not in contradiction to anything we say. It just means that you're doing too much work. I mean, just like having a reversible computer, you need to keep a lot more information than you actually need. But it's actually interesting because at least in some versions of these papers, they use Hamiltonian dynamics. I mean, they use the area preserving or measure preserving maps, which must be contracting in some dimension, which I call them the relevant dimension, and actually diverging or have positively Lyapunov exponents in the irrelevant dimensions. And when you think about it, this is actually echoing the classical physics paradox between the reversible microscopic laws of physics and the irreversible nature of thermodynamics, like entropy increase. So this is actually a very interesting criticism, which is bringing back a lot of interesting arguments from the history of physics into machine learning. Now, of course, there are algorithms which don't use stochastic gradients. I don't talk about these algorithms. I mean, most of the deep learning today is using one way or another some version of SGD. When you do something else, a lot of these things are different. But as far as I know, nobody is really training neural networks with, let's say, second-order methods. This simply don't work, and there's a good reason for it, which I hope to mention later on. So we actually need this local stochastic version of the gradient to really expose diffuse, if you want, all the landscape in some sense in order to be efficient. And if you make big jumps in this optimization process, you don't get it. Of course, I don't need the actual convergence to a global Gibbs distribution. All we need is only a local Gibbs distribution, a local type of equilibrium, and I'll say again why this is the case. Okay, so I said already in the morning that we look at the neural network as some sort of a Markov chain, and I look at all the hidden layers as some sort of an internal representation, but this internal representation has this hierarchical structure that each layer is mapped to the other in one way, and therefore is coarsening, the representation is getting coarser and coarser when you go through the layers. And eventually the last hidden layer is the important one in the sense that from it there is a very simple decoding. Now just to make sure that we all know what we're talking about, I just want to make sure that you all recognize these functions. So I need this notion of the KL divergence or the cross entropy or the information divergence. There are many different names for this, which is essentially nothing more than the average log likelihood of two distributions, log likelihood ratio of two distributions, average respect to one of them, and this is a non-negative quantity, which is really the fundamental measure in information theory. It has all sorts of good properties, which I don't have time to describe now. But what I need is really this notion of mutual information, which essentially is the KL divergence between the joint distribution of two variables and the product of their marginals, and this is essentially zero when they are independent, and is positive otherwise, but actually can be understood in various ways. One of them is what I need here, which is the uncertainty or the entropy of the variable x when I'm removed by the knowledge of the variable y. So essentially, if I know the variable y, the conditional entropy of x on y is how much uncertainty is left in x when I know y, and the difference is the uncertainty that is removed from x when I know y. This is a very important quantity in information theory, which essentially tells us how many bits or how many binary yes-no questions I have to ask about x in order to reveal everything that x knows about y, or vice versa. Now in our case, x is the complex variable, the input variable, which has high entropy, and y is the simple variable, which has low entropy. So usually we think about how much we need to squeeze the information out of x. In some other versions of learning or deep learning, y and x can be similar. For example, if you're talking about autoencoders, but that's a different story. Then the compression is to some intermediate bottleneck variable which actually compresses the information from which you actually recover another version of this. Now the problem, the main properties of mutual information that you all know need to know now is the what we call data processing inequality, or DPI, which is essentially the fact that information along the Markov chain can only decrease. And it's also important to realize that an immediate consequence of that is that mutual information is invariant to reversible transformation. So the value of the mutual information has infinitely many equivalent representation of the variables. I mean, any one-to-one transformation of x or y will not change the mutual information. Now, this also tells us that mutual information is not a good measure of computational complexity, because I can encrypt, for example, my variables, or can make an arbitrary permutation or transformation of the representation without changing mutual information at all. So this means that the fact that mutual information is preserved is not telling us anything about how easy it is or how hard it is to solve the problem, and that's exactly why we need another ingredient, which is this the dynamic properties of stochastic randomness. Now, once looking on the neural network through these eyes of mutual information, I have these two chains of data processing inequalities. The mutual information between the input and any one of the layers can only go down, because this is the way the Markov chain goes. And because I'm thinking about the desired y, which is, I want to think about generalization, not about the actual output of the network, which is y hat here. So the information between the output, the desired output y and any one of the layers, which is really the optimal decoding of the layers, I'll see in a second, is also going down along the layers. So I have these two passes of inequalities. And of course we can think about each one of the layers as inducing some sort of partition of the variable x, and this partition is only get a coarser when I move through the layers, and this coarsening is sometimes referred to a successive refinement or successive coarsening of the relevant information. Now, as I said, individual neurons can be easily scrambled because any function which is a one-to-one between two layers can scramble the layers totally without changing information. So in this language of mutual information, all the networks which are related to each other by some sort of inverted transformations of the weights between the two layers are not going to change anything with another. So there are many, many different networks which are described by the same writer. Now, if you want to be a little more information theoretic, the best way of thinking about the problem is to think about the encoder of the layer as some sort of a stochastic map from the input to the layer, which I call PT given x. So T is the same as H. So let's say for this particular layer Ti, this is the encoder is the map induced by all the layers previously, and the decoder essentially is how do I decode the label or the desired label from the layer. Remember that I'm thinking about actually two decoders. One of them is what is the information in the layer about the true desired Y, and then you can think about the map from the layer to the actual output of the network. Of course, when the network is perfectly trained, Y hat and Y are very similar, and the decoder of the layer is essentially equivalent to the optimal decoder of the desired Y. But this is not the case in general, and certainly not during the training. Now, when you move through the layers, the complexity of the encoder becomes more and more increased from layer to layer, while the complexity of the decoder decreases, and eventually the last layer has a very simple decoder, which is just linearly separable with just a hyperplane or a set of hyperplanes. And my main mathematical claim is that essentially out of all these different very complicated, very high-dimensional machines, there are only two numbers that really matter, at least when the problem becomes very large. And these are the mutual information of the encoder and the mutual information of the decoder of the layer. And how they behave really tell us the whole story in some sense. And that's a huge reduction in complexity. And of course, it's a little bit surprising. I mean, how can it be that only these two numbers eventually mature? And this is essentially one of my main claims, that asymptotically in the size of the input, only these two numbers matter for anything that we really care about. And the thing we really care about are what is the sample complexity, which means how many examples I actually need in order to achieve a certain generalization error. This is the classical question in learning theory. But also I want to understand what the layer represents and something about the structure. I want all those pairs, not only the last layer, but all of them tell us a very interesting story. So in some sense, I reduce the complexity of the problem from this huge dimensional space, huge dimensionality of all the weights, to these two numbers per layer, which is a lot more manageable. And of course, then I can do this kind of trick of plotting, which is some sort of a direct convincing argument that really it's only these two numbers that tell us maybe not all the story, but a very interesting story. And as I said, when you look at this movie, you have to ask yourself, okay, first of all, is this the general picture? I mean, do we see this for all types of networks? This is one of the points we were attacked on, of course. And I argue that we see this in all networks, and they actually get sharper and sharper the larger the network, as long as we have some sort of nonlinearity, and as long as you eventually learn the rule, you see this type of trajectory. Of course, the details of the dynamics and where the layers converge and so on change from architecture to architecture, from problem to problem, but this type of behavior that everything concentrates in these two variables to essentially one point as a function of time is a very general phenomenon. By the way, even the papers that attacked us, I mean, like Saxetal, eventually agreed with this conclusion that it is these two numbers that matter. Now, the reason these two numbers really tell us the story is that ITY, I mean, the information about the desired label, is essentially governing the generalization error, so this is why it's so important. And ITX, the compression, how much information each layer remembers about the input, and essentially governs what this network represents and how many examples I need in order to achieve this representation.
Tali?
Now, yes.
I just wondered if there's up to here any question in the audience and wanted to give explicit the possibility to ask something, if there is. Yeah, there are two questions. Is it okay for you if I pass a microphone?
I'm glad it works.
Thanks. So if I understand you correctly, these two mutual informations, are these in your statistical mechanics picture, are these macroscopic variables you're trying to
yes.
investigate?
Yes,
and in a sense,
yes, precisely.
you're finding...
These are other properties in some sense. I mean, this is like magnetization or like entropy or energy, if you want. I mean, these are things which govern, essentially it's very much like entropy and energy, because I'm looking at the trade-off of these two things, and this is some sort of a free energy. So it's really, these are macroscopic variables. They depend on all the properties of the microscopic variable, which are the weights in this case.
And so to draw this analogy further, are you going to construct a classical thermodynamic theory of these variables? Are you going to find laws of state laws between these mutual information variables?
Well, I wouldn't call it classical thermodynamics because it has very little to do with classical thermodynamics, but it has similar formal properties, yes, in the sense that you're actually interested only in some optimal trade-off between these two things, very much like free energy in thermodynamics. But the details are different. I'll come to this. If you're asking these questions, I'll definitely address them later on.
And finally, so do you expect that using only these macroscopic variables, you will be able to construct neural nets where you don't have to work with all those millions of weights, but only with fewer of these macroscopic variables?
Well, this is a tricky question. I mean, if it was thermodynamics, then you know, okay, I don't have to worry about the location of every molecule in the room. It will take care of itself in some sense. And what I worry about is only the properties of the macroscopic variables, like, you know, entropy, energy, temperature, pressure, things like this. Now, in a sense, that's what I'm saying, that a lot of the actual values of the weights is statistical. I mean, it obeys some sort of a Gibbs distribution. But you know, this is, but we are training the network using some sort of gradient descent on those microscopic variables. And so the game is a little more complicated. I mean, it's not. I mean, in some sense, if you think about the energy function in physics as a function of the microscopic variables, minimizing the energy is actually acting on every molecule. But the state of the system eventually, which we care about, depends only on those microscopic. So it is similar, yes. But I don't want to get into it because I'm not sure that everyone there is a physicist. And maybe I'm losing some of the people.
I have another question, just for understanding. Looking at your mutual information plot where you showed ITX and ITY. Why is it, just from my understanding, that the ITY of the lower levels is already 1 for an untrained network?
Yeah, okay, so maybe we look at this picture, which on the left, I don't know if you see it well enough, or here, on my previous slide. Yeah, so this is the initial or the first hidden layer.
At the moment, we don't see your current picture, somehow it hangs. There it is, wonderful.
I'm sorry, there's some delay here. Okay, so you see this blue layer, which, as I said, is 100 different networks trained with different initial conditions, but they all look very similar. And as you said, I mean, they have all the information about the input, which in this case is just 12 bits, and also all the information about the output, because all the information in the original data is there. Now remember, mutual information is an average over all the inputs. So in this case, these are averages over 4,096, or 2 to the 12 patterns. And therefore it really summarizes everything that the initial data has about the label, which is one bit, otherwise I couldn't label it. Now, once I progress through the layers, this information is lost in the initial conditions. Because these randomized weights, especially when I contract the layers, don't preserve information. They project me to some random lower dimension, which has very little information with the initial distribution. So this is why the first layer actually had all the information, because it's just a one-to-one map of the input, very closely to one-to-one. There's some little loss information here, but once I progress through the layers, I see this very big drop of information in the initial. This is, by the way, very architecture dependent. I mean, if you have a network with layers, let's say, which are of the same width as the input, you don't really contract the width of the layers, you're not going to see this type of drop of information. All the layers are going to have all the information as essentially just one-to-one transformations or one-to-one functions of the input, and therefore don't lose information about the output. So the fact that I'm losing information here is due to the specific architecture we use in this problem. Is this clear?
Yeah. Question answered. There was another question over there. Tali, do you still show the slide with the information plane? Because the picture is somehow not updated here?
No, I wanted to see you, but I can't do it together. So if I want to look at you, you can't see my slide. Okay, here's the slide. Yeah.
Okay, so I just have a question. It's a bit at the higher level. So the question is that I want to see about the things that you are saying, up to which extent it is related to neural networks, or to which it is related to any model which is chained. Because when you're talking about like a chain of models, neural networks is not the only one. Maybe probably if you consider the boosting paradigm, it also does somehow a chain of models. But okay, with different semantics probably. But how you can basically connect these two together? Do you think any relation between, like, in general, different strategies for chaining models, or because both of them surprisingly show very good performance, you know, in several problems nowadays.
Yeah. So again, this is a very good question. I think that the general structure of theory doesn't depend on the specifics of neural networks, at least not at this point. Later on, it will. I mean, later on, I'll show you the fact that a linearly separated hyperplane that the neurons actually implement is important. But at this point, when talking just about the progression or the flow of information through the layers, it's true for any chain model that is any Markov chain, including boosting in some versions of it. And actually, it also applies to current neural networks if you think about the state of the network in time as a Markov chain, and so on. So there are many different versions that can match into the same structure theoretically, and this hyperplane representation, this information plane representation is useful for them. And so actually, yes, please do look at other models which have this structure. If you can actually estimate this information, that's really the big problem. Because in general, estimating this information with high dimension is the big headache. But the flow of information through those layers is in common to all models which have this hierarchical structure. And but the crucial point is that they have to be large enough, such that this totality argument of information, which I have said is going to work. Okay, so maybe let me move on a little bit. So again, I showed this figure before. These are those contours of the flow, the average trajectory of those.
We don't see the image at the moment.
Well, it should appear somewhere.
I hope. Maybe somehow the audio and video quality is gradually degrading. Maybe we should restart the call, so maybe it goes down after 45 minutes. I don't know.
So you don't see,
there it is.
Not,
wonderful.
See?
Yeah.
I hear you perfectly, by the way. But anyway, so I just want you to look at this very busy picture Again, here on the right, there is this average contours of the layers. And as I said, I mean, the details of how the hidden layers change depend on the architecture. So this very fast growth of information is architecture dependent, but the last hidden layer is going to do a very similar trajectory no matter what architecture. And I argue that these two phases, the fitting phase from A to C, and then the compression phase from C to E, are essential and the most important part of deep learning due to stochastic gradient descent is actually now.
The video is not updating here. Maybe we restart the call to somehow regain the frequent update of the picture. Is that okay for you?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Let's try it.
Okay.
In the meantime, are there more questions at that point? After that.
Yes, so just
Hello again. Yeah, now it works better.
well, I need to share my screen in order for the whole thing to work. So now you see me as I see you.
Now we see us again. Hi.
I'm fine. Is it okay now? So I can move back to my slides.
Yeah.
Okay. So again,
No more questions yet. Just to check at the moment. Yeah, I would say, yeah, a question.
Hi, I just have a quick question. I found it very interesting, this conclusion that you made, and I'm not an expert in neural networks, so it might my question might be trivial. But you said that basically you know in this analysis that you're presenting that this error bound shows that no machine learning technique can achieve better performance than an arbitrarily complex neural network. And I'm just
long enough data. Yeah.
Yes, I'm giving a specific data set. So I'm just I in general I agree with it, but I'm wondering if this is not a little bit of a trivial statement in a way, because that's if considering that that a neural network is nothing else than an ensemble of function approximators that I just put together using some sort of function to combine them together. Then it's just, you can build an arbitrarily complex function approximator as long as you allow arbitrarily complex ensemble of those functions. So it's kind of like saying like if you make a function approximation, then all you need is Fourier transform, because it can, given infinite amount of sine wave scale, you can approximate any function with that, so problem solved. So I'm...
No, let me stop you right there.
Okay.
I mean, and let me continue. But, so first of all, yes, this would be nice if a universal function approximator could fit any size of data without overfitting. But we know it's not true. I mean, in general, if you really have an arbitrarily complex function, you need infinite data to fit it. So the secret here is in the fact that I'm not really overfitting. I mean, I'm overfitting eventually, but just saying that this can approximate any function because it's a very complex functional approximator would not explain the lack of the good generalization that these layers in network achieve. Now, it is, I mean, and I'm sure you know that, I mean, if I have an infinite class of arbitrarily complex functions, I can fit any data arbitrarily well, but generalize very poorly. The fact that there is some sort of self-regularization in these networks is really the surprise. I'm talking about generalization and not about fitting. Functional approximation is curve fitting. Curve fitting, we know how to do since Gauss, and we know since him you very often compared to the data, you're going to miserably represent data outside of the data. The whole point about learning is generalization. And the interesting question is not whether this is a rich enough function, class of functions, or if the expressivity is large enough, but how is it that we eventually manage to control the complexity and not overfit? And this, I argue, happens through this compression phase, which is very different from function approximation. Function approximation is not doing this explicitly, it's doing it only implicitly through regularization. But essentially what I'm saying is that the noise in the stochastic gradient descent is doing this regularization for you in a very interesting way, even if you don't have any clue about the origin of the function, because this cannot work unless the function is stable enough to noise. I mean, if there's some sort of compressibility. And I'll come back to this later on. But I want to argue already with your first statement. I'm not saying a trivial thing like, you know, it's rich enough to express any function, and then if you give it enough data, it will learn it. No, the point is that it actually does a very good job, even with limited data, despite the fact that these are very complex functions. And that's really the magic, which we want to understand.
Okay.
Okay, so let me continue just a little bit. We have enough time, but it's running out quickly.
I would suggest you go on with the talk, and you guys please raise your hand if there are questions in between. Otherwise, we will have half an hour for the next question session.
Yeah, we are 1,000 miles away, so the communication is not entirely smooth, but it's all right. 2,000 miles away.
Wow.
Anyway, so I'm trying to convince you, first of all, that there is some things, and it's actually directly related to this last question. So this has been around for a while, and people know this. So I just want to contrast the way we think about generalization. Maybe I'll skip. Don't skip it. I want to say something about it. So on the left here, you see the structure of the classical generalization bounds in learning theory. And they are usually always have this type of form, even if the details are slightly different, which is the generalization error, which I call here epsilon, is bounded by the log of an epsilon cover of the hypothesis class of my functions. So let's say if you're talking about Fourier transforms, as you just did, if I don't band limit my Fourier functions, the frequency of my functions, I'm unbounded in terms of the cover here. So because I cannot really sample it with any finite frequency and still get good approximation. So band limited functions, if this is clear to everyone, are just one example of a function class which can be epsilon approximated very well, but by Nyquist theorem, essentially. But anyway, so what we have here is that the generalization error is bounded by essentially the log of the number of functions within an error epsilon in my class, which is log h epsilon, divided by the number of data points, which is m here. And the way to prove this bound is very easy. You just use Chernoff and bound and then the union bound on the Chernoff bound and the individual hypothesis and the union bound over the whole class. And this is really valiant and this dominated learning theory for many years. And what is very nice about it is you know that this epsilon cover of the hypothesis class, if this hypothesis class has a finite dimension, and this dimension can be the Hausdorff dimension or the VC dimension or anything like this, then I know that the cardinality of my cover of a compact set scales like 1 over epsilon to the d, where d is the dimension of this class. So essentially, when I plug this here, I get that the error is bounded by d over epsilon, d over m. And this confidence bound, by the way, is completely negligible when you talk about very large problems, because this is essentially a fixed number, and with these two scales with the data. So if m is million and this is 10, then it's completely negligible. Now, the point is that these type of bounds, as I said already, don't work for deep learning, because any reasonable estimate of the dimension of the network is of the order of the number of weights, or let's say square root of the number of weights if you're talking about CNNs or things like this, and this is still way too high. I mean, the number, so I get here numbers in the orders of billions, and here I have orders of hundreds of thousands, and according to these bounds, neural networks should not work. They should overfit or should not generalize. And this is actually the right answer to your questions. So this is not, I mean, machine learning is beyond overfitting. If beyond just curve fitting. If I just had to curve to fit the data to a curve in some class, then obviously the number of data points should be of the same order of the number of parameters, which is of the order of dimension. But now something completely different happens. And that's why I believe that we have to forget about this theory and look at something completely different. It's not really completely different. So I'm actually modifying the bound a little bit. So, you know, if, let's say I think about only the Boolean functions, so I'm looking at the right hand now. Only Boolean functions from x to 0 or 1, so the number of this function is 2 to the cardinality of x. Thinking about finite spaces now. Which means that if h of epsilon is of the order of 2 to the x, I'm sorry, then the plugging this here gets me the cardinality of x over m, which is useless. I mean, it tells me that I actually need examples the same as the number of patterns. Remember, x is the number of possible inputs here. Now, imagine somehow magically I can change, instead of sampling the x, I have to sample only a subset or some sort of cover of x. That's really a basic thing which a lot of people misunderstand in my talks. So imagine that x is this space, this ellipse, and every point here is a pattern, possible input pattern. And now imagine that somehow I know how to quantize the pattern such that within each one of those cells, with these pink cells, the label is the same. Or the probability of the label is the same, apart from stochastic rule. Then, essentially, instead of sampling all the data, I need to sample only one point in each one of those pink circles, which means that I can think about, instead of the function class of 2 to the cardinality of x, only a 2 to the cardinality of the kernel. Because I need only one label in each one of those things. So this looks like a very simple trick. I mean, if I can sample my inputs without losing the homogeneity of this, essentially it tells you that there is a neighborhood to every pattern or stability, if you want, or noise insensitivity to the pattern, that if I add just a little noise or a large noise to the pattern or do some other transformation like rotating it or translating it, this is not going to change the label. Then I can partition my input into cells like this, and there is a good way of guaranteeing that the cells are homogeneous. And essentially, of information theory, it means that I'm quantizing the space x with respect to the KL divergence, so the probability of the label given the input and probability of the label given the partition. And this is bounding for example, the Pinsky, through the Pinsky inequality, the actual error, which is the magnitude square, let's say, or L1 square of the difference in the probability of the label and probability of the label given partition. So this type of guarantees, if I know how to cover my space with respect to this measure, I actually know how to cover it with respect to any reasonable error. And that's why the Mission information, which is essentially just the average of this scale divergence measure, or the difference in Mission information is exactly this type of distortion, is actually governing the error, any error that you care about. And in particular, this type of error, which is most people care about, the probability of taking a wrong label, is governed by Mission information. Now I want to assume typicality, and that's something which we really need to express carefully. So essentially, I argue that neural networks will work well for problems which have what we call conditional factorization. So in some sense, things like Markov random fields or hidden Markov models or local Hamiltonians, or locally interacting Hamiltonians, or graphical models which have finite degrees. And there are many, essentially all the models that really are interested in terms of image recognition, or in terms of speech recognition, or in terms of text, or in terms of whatever it is, that molecular biology, they usually have this type of structure, at least approximately this type of structure. Which means that I can talk about typicality, but notice that this is a little bit different from the typicality used in information theory in general. Information theory, we talk about typical sequences, which are pieces of a signal, and here I'm talking about a typical image or a typical input. So when the input becomes very large, I can write the probability of, let's say, of the pixels of an image. The log of this probability is going to factorize. Maybe I should show it here. So essentially, if I can write the probability of an image given the partition, or the probability of the image itself as some sort of a product of each of those pixels given only the neighborhood of this pixel. So if you look at an image, for example, and you give me a small neighborhood of every pixel, the probability of the pixel almost certainly depends only on what happens in the neighborhood. So this type of locality of the patterns is actually extremely common, and I actually argue I hardly know anything else. I mean, if this is not the case, for example, in parity functions or in highly scrambled images or something like this, then you're not going to learn it with neural networks. It's not going to work. But if it works, then these two quantities, the mutual information between the input and the layer, and the mutual information between the layer and the output, factorize. I mean, that the probability factorizes, and the log of the probability looks like a sum of many condition-independent terms, and therefore the central limit theorem, for example, is telling me that this is going to average very quickly. So this type of property allows me to use this particular typicality. So if I'm close enough to this average property, the probability of the pattern is just 2 to the entropy, and the probability of the conditional pattern and the partition is also around the entropy or the conditional entropy. And this alone is giving me this, this assumption alone is giving me these concentration results for the mutual information value. So this is again, to the previous question, this is why these two are macroscopic variables that tend to concentrate when the problem becomes large. And this is also the reason, I mean, not only why I see this concentration in the information plane, but also what underlies, I believe, behind the problems which can be learned by neural networks. This concentration. Now, if I use this information theoretically inside, I can actually estimate the size of the cover simply by dividing.
Sorry, here's a question, I guess.
Yes.
Can we interrupt you for a second?
Yes, I'm interrupted.
For previous exercise, because I see you introduce the noise by using the sigmoid activation function. And then, because I understand why you added noise, because you wanted to change the rule to a stochastic rule. But I don't understand why it is important to add noise.
Okay, so do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, I'm not adding noise. I'm not explicitly adding noise. By the way, there are papers, there are other people there who are doing similar things. For example, the group of Stefano Soato at UCLA, and some others who actually talk about stochastic networks in order to estimate mutual information, and they actually assume that there is noise. I'm not assuming that. I'm just saying, first of all, okay, let's think first of all about stochastic rules in the sense that all we have is just the probability of the label given the input. Now, you're saying in general you have deterministic rules. So I actually argue that for large enough problems, this is hardly the case. When you think about image recognition or the face recognition, for example, there's always a small probability that an image of you will not be recognized there, or something like this. So I cannot really, strictly speaking, talk about fully deterministic rules. It's not the case. So, but it's enough for the theoretical argument is that I need the rule to be slightly stochastic, not the network to be stochastic. The network can be deterministic. What I'm saying that to add noise, I mean, there are many people who want to avoid this complication. I'm already out of 1 hour, and I have a lot of spoilers to tell you. So this will come in a few slides. I'll mention it again, but I just want to correct this impression of yours that I'm adding noise. I'm not adding noise, but I do assume assume...
Did that answer the question to some extent? Yes, a little bit. Okay. Tali, let's restart the Skype call again because the quality is again like decreasing. Is that okay?
Yeah, okay.
And just immediately restart.
Yeah, we are losing time, but...
But maybe we can understand you better. So
Yeah,
I restart. It didn't ask me if the quality was fine. Learning system behind it.
All right.
Hello.
Hello. Yes, it's better, but
Yeah.
do you hear me now?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, so I hope I don't have to repeat the answer to the last question. It's just that I'm not assuming a stochastic network, but I do assume a slightly stochastic rule, which means that there is some sort of noise in the rule itself. And I argue that this is a very weak assumption. Even a very small noise will suffice for that. Now, let's go back to this argument. So essentially, what I'm saying that using information theory here, I can actually estimate the cardinality of this class 2 to the Ti.
Oh, I think you have to switch on your... Yeah, there it is. Perfect.
There's some delay here. Wow. So essentially, this 2 to the T epsilon is 2 to the I Tx, and this is really interesting because if this is the case, I somehow managed to compress my input, then I get that the hypothesis class, or the original hypothesis class, actually behaves like 2 to the 2 to the I. And this 2 to the 2 to the I, when you plug it here in the low cardinality place, you get this type of bound. And this type of bound is further and much more impressive because the compression reduces the complexity of the class exponentially fast. So k bits of compression of the representation is equivalent to a factor of 2 to the k on the input size. Now, I know that people are a little bit confused by this argument, but there are many other ways to see it much more rigorously, but I want to go on at this point. So, once you believe me, based on this argument or similar arguments, that it is these two values of information, ITY and ITX, which really tell us the story about trade-off between sample complexity and accuracy, then the interesting question is, what is the bound that I can put? Is there a line in this space which is really the best you can do? And here I don't want to get into a lot of details, but we can actually calculate this bound. So what is the maximum information of the maximum compression that we can achieve without losing information about the label? So let's say that I want to be 99% correct. I put some line here, and then I want to minimize the information I have to remember in order to achieve this 99% correct. Now there are very good reasons to consider this particular variation or problem, and we call it information bottleneck bound, but it's actually some sort of where this is very related to the notion of minimal sufficient statistics. So essentially, this is trying to find the simplest possible representation of X. And as I showed you before, if I manage to compress, I also manage to save data. So there's a direct relationship between the compression of the representation and how many data points I have. Now, the funny thing is that this variational problem that I put some Lagrange multiplier on my information, on the distortion of the information that I want to preserve, has this very simple looking, or maybe not so simple, but it looks simple, solution, which is depending only on the joint distribution of X and Y. And this, when I change beta, which is just the slope of this curve, gives me this black line, which is this wall above which you cannot find any representation. So above this line is unachievable, and below this line is achievable, and if I look at the neural network, the best it can do is to get all the way to this line. Now what I actually argue, that this is what happens if the network is rich enough. So essentially, this is an interesting, in some sense, in this plan, once I convince you, I hope that this plan is interesting, and that's what you really want to see, the best you can do is being on this black line, and this black line can actually be extremely close to the one line here, but because I assume some small stochasticity in my problem, it's not going to be exactly on the line, it's going to reduce a little bit. But when I have finite data, then the problem dramatically changes. When I have finite data, then my ability to estimate the information is dropped by exactly this number again, 2 to the information of the compression divided by the number of examples, which is essentially this difference between the black line here, which is the best I can do with all the data, and the red line here, which is what I can do only with finite data. Now, of course, the more data I have, the more the red line is going to get closer to the black line. But notice that with the red line, without any compression, with finite data I do very poorly. I cannot get high information about why. But when I compress the representation, I get more and more data, labeled data points in each one of those coarse partitions. So when I reduce the representation, the information actually coarsen the partition. It's just like adding larger and larger spheres in this figure, and this coarsening of the partition is going to improve my estimation of the information, and that's why the red line has a very big drop of information in the very fine partition, which is the beginning of the network, and when I compress the representation, the last hidden layers are going to be optimally around the maximum of this red curve. So this is why you really need to compress. I mean, if you don't have enough data, you want the last hidden layer to be here, and you want to move it further to the left in this plane, otherwise it will not generalize. So in general, you have 2 types of errors. One is due to the fact that the noisy, that there is what I call a compression loss. Any compression in general will lose some information. But there is another loss, which is the difference between the black curve and the red curve, which is this due to the finite sample loss. And surprisingly, the difference between the black and the red curve is of the same order, 2 to the I over m, which I had before in the learning flow, in the translation error. So it's not surprising. It's actually exactly the same thing. But this means that whatever will give me good generalization is also minimizing the distance between the red and the black. So essentially now I just have to explain to show you that something in stochastic gradient descent is really pushing the layers towards this black curve, and eventually put the last hidden layer close to this maximum generalization, minimum generalization error, maximum information about the layer. Now I know that not everything that is here is completely clear, but let me go on anyway, and then see if I can clarify this. So again, this is really just I showed you this figure before, but now after you see this type of bound, you see again what happens here. If I have enough data, the red curve is very close to the black curve, and that's why I stay on the right here. In the well-trained case, I stay very high, because the maximum of the red curve is very close to the black curve. If I don't have enough data, the red curve is going to drop me down dramatically, and in some sense, I'm going to have a very big trade-off. So essentially what I'm arguing, that these two, the limiting points of the layers, both with small data and with large data, depend essentially only on the joint distribution of x and y and on the sample size, nothing else. Essentially, this is what comes into these bounds. It's only the joint distribution of the mutual information values, which can be calculated from the joint distribution, and the number of samples, and other things like the cardinality of the label and so on. That's not important. Okay, so now, so this is actually a fascinating problem to actually calculate those finite sample limit bounds, and we know how to do it, but I don't want to get into it right now due to time. I just want to give you the gist of the mechanism. So again, the reason I argue that we have compression is because there is some sort of saturation of the error. So let's look at the same video again of the information plane evolution of trajectories together with the training, actually this is generalization error. And what you see here is that during this fitting phase until the last layer groups here, I make a very big drop in the error from 0.5 to about 0.1. And then essentially the training error and the generalization error tend to flatten, and the training error essentially saturates here. And everything that happens from this very slow motion to the left, this compression phase, is happening in a very slow decrease of the error. So it means the gradients are small. So there is this very sharp mean, typically in the training error and in the generalization error. They really follow each other in this phase. And later on, I see a slow improvement in generalization, which is completely parallel to this slow diffusion of all the layers to the left. Okay, so my argument, and I said it already very quickly in the last talk, these are very different phases. This is here we have a very fast decay of the error and very clean gradient. And from here on, from this mean, you get a relatively or very noisy gradient, which correspond to a very different dynamics of the widths. So this happens either in different problems in different ways, and I can show you many examples like this. This is a different, much easier problem. You see different but essentially very similar behavior. I mean, again, very fast drop of the error, and then the slow improvement. But this slow improvement is actually extremely important, because this is what's going to take the error from, let's say, 1% to 1 over 10 million, which makes the whole thing so important. So you really need to look at the error in a logarithmic scale here, because they improve the difference in 1 to 1,000 to 1 to million can make all the difference commercially for a product. I mean, so this is really, this last phase of the training is so important in practice. So again, you see this very fast, this is a different problem. You see a very sharp decrease and then a very slow decrease of error, which corresponds to this diffusion phase. And as I said before, this diffusion phase is due to the behavior of the gradients. I don't want to repeat it now. I just want to show you what actually happens here is that the sharp decrease in the signal to noise ratio of the gradients, this is again a logarithmic scale, is exactly the point where the telling of the information, so whenever the signal to noise ratio decreases, you get this very sharp convergence to better compression. So the compression phase is right after the sharp decrease in the error. This is for every layer. These are the colors are for the different layers, and you see that they're very, very similar to each other, but not exactly the same. And you see, by the way, that if you change the mini batch size of the number of examples, everything scales very nicely linearly, and even the full batch, which is essentially no noise in the gradients, looks like another very noisy version of the same problem. So the small noise that you calculate in full batch due to the finite sample and due to the finite precision of the gradients is actually acting very much like the noise that is induced by the mini batch size. Okay, so here is the gist of the proof why there is always compression. And this is related to the question of whether I assume noise or not. So again, this is an intuitive picture. We have a very rigorous statement now, but I want to give you the gist of it. So again, we look at the weights in the layer K, and we see that they converge eventually to some optimal weights in the layer K, which are essentially the best projection to a low dimension that preserve all the information about my label, and this is what I call the canonical correlation analysis weights, or the CCA weights. But there's another component to the weights, which I call delta W. This delta W is the accumulated fluctuations in the gradients. Now, if you remember, maybe I didn't say, the fluctuations in the gradients are due to the batch-to-batch fluctuation are due to the fact that the irrelevant parts of the problem, like let's say the background in an image, can change dramatically from image to image. There's nothing in the label that tells me this is relevant and this is irrelevant. The network has to learn on its own that this is part of my face and I need to remember it, or this is a feature that I really need to be of my eyes to my nose and so on. These are important features, but there are many other things in the image, like the illumination or the background or whether I have hat or not or whatever, which are irrelevant to my identity. All those different dimensions of the problem have to be learned to ignore, to be found irrelevant. What in the training is actually telling me ignore those dimensions? And this is exactly where we go beyond curve fitting. So it's this diffusion, this delta W is an accumulated noisy gradient. It behaves like a Wiener process, essentially, and eventually this accumulation of the gradients is acting effectively for large problems like a random matrix, which has a very strange covariance matrix. It is very skewed. It has a very high variance in the irrelevant dimensions and a very small preserved variance in the relevant dimension of the problem. Now, the relevant dimensions are precisely those things that we need to worry about, those features that if you change them, you change the label. But almost everything else in this high-dimensional space is irrelevant. And this is how the network eventually learned to ignore the irrelevant components by adding this slow diffusion. So why the diffusion is much faster in the irrelevant dimensions, because nothing is going to prevent the weights from growing in these dimensions, because they're not affecting the label. So fluctuations in those irrelevant dimensions, which are induced by the batch-to-batch fluctuations, which as I said are due to the different backgrounds of each image, are going to grow like square root of t eventually in these irrelevant dimensions and create this delta W matrix, where when I multiply this delta W matrix by the previous layer, once I train the network, this random Wiener process multiplied by this input previous layer is in large dimension looks perfectly like a Gaussian noise. That's of course something we need to argue with exactly, but it's very easy to understand. I mean, large dimension sum of a lot of independent random terms, and they look very much like Gaussian noise because the covariance, which is precisely the covariance of the gradients themselves. So this is cute because it's telling me that the information between the layer K and the layer K plus 1 is bounded by the information of this Gaussian channel. And I'm sorry if I'm not clear to everyone, but I want to say it anyway. This is a nonlinear function, the sigmoid or whatever function of a linear product of the weights by the previous layer plus something which looks like a Gaussian noise, which is highly non-uniform. It's very high in the irrelevant dimension, it's very low in the relevant dimension. So I can decompose the information between the layers as a sum of actually those Gaussian channels, which is going to be, the Gaussian channel has a very low capacity because the signal to noise ratio is going to be very high, very low in the irrelevant dimension. It's going to be very high in the relevant dimension. And this works perfectly because this WCCA and the Wiener process which is generated by the noise are actually commute with each other. When I close to the minimum of this Haitian matrix. So essentially, Haitian, this Gaussian will. So essentially, this is a direct argument why the irrelevant components of the data are forgotten by this diffusion phase, and why the layers are compressed to especially that. But it tells me actually much more. It tells me exactly which information, or what part of information is really compressed or ignored between two consecutive layers. Now, I know there are many questions. Let me just go a little bit further. So first of all, yes, this thing is seen on every problem that we looked at, including things like MNIST and CIFAR 10 at least, and even ImageNet to some extent. It's just getting harder and harder to make this direct estimate of information by bidding or anything like this. But this argument, this Gaussian argument, can be done just by looking at the gradients taken from TensorFlow or anything like this, and I can calculate this Gaussian bound on the information without any estimation of information directly. And this is what we do now, and we see this very nicely. This is, by the way, what happens here on the left when you have an architecture which doesn't compress. So all the layers have the same width except the last one. And you see that despite the fact that there is no initial drop of information in the hidden layers, the last layer does exactly the same type of trajectory by first fitting the data and then compressing the representation, while the hidden layers lose information about the input. Okay, so the result of this analysis, when done carefully, again, is that nothing is going to stop the layers from reaching this optimal information theoretic bound. And and the argument, there's a more rigorous argument why they actually do this. I'm not sure I want to get into it, but for those of you who still follow me, the dynamics of the training is essentially a Lagrangian dynamics. I mean, the derivative of the weight with respect to time goes like minus the gradient of the error plus some sort of noise. This noise is highly non-isotropic, and that's why it's not converging to Gibbs distribution uniformly, but only locally. But because the characteristic of the noise is precisely the same covariance matrix of the gradients that I showed you before, and this near the minimum is the same matrix as the Hessian matrix of the error. So eventually this Lagrangian equation can be diagonalized, and each coordinate is having its own diffusion, and the irrelevant coordinates after diagonalization push me to very low noise, and the only thing which is left are the relevant components. And you can see this, that eventually you converge locally to a Gibbs distribution, and this Gibbs distribution, just by using the Bayes rule essentially, is giving me that the encoder information, the map between t and x, is essentially exponential in the DKL between y given x and y given t. And so this comes from this immediately, which is the information boundary bound. So this is essentially the essence of why compression happens here and why the layers are pushed to this bound. Are there any questions here?
Yes, I see a couple of hands just over here.
Thank you. My question is a bit about the Saxi et al. Paper. There, the alpha basically they changed the non-linearity from a bounded function like hyperbolic tangent to ReLU. And they kind of claim that there is no compression, but still the network generalizes well. You mentioned at the beginning of the lecture that their claim is wrong. I would like to know in what part that claim is wrong.
Okay. All right. Thank you for this question. So first of all, if you followed my argument before, I showed you that there is compression independent of the nonlinearity. I mean, the nonlinearity was sigma, and this can be tangent, hyperbolic, or rectifier, or even a linear function. The compression is due to this Gaussian channel, which is inside the nonlinearity. So the information after the nonlinearity is bounded by the information in the Gaussian channel due to the data processing equality. So if I show you that there is compression in the Gaussian channel, there's also compression after the nonlinearity. It's only a stronger compression. Now, this is why essentially the argument is wrong. There's compression which is independent of the nonlinearity. Now, why do they don't see it? I mean, so they have two types of argument. One of them is that all the compression is due to the saturation of the nonlinearity. This is wrong. I just proved it to you. This is wrong. And its compression is actually due to the accumulated noise in the weights. It's not the saturation of the nonlinearity, it doesn't matter. And the other one is that they don't see compression for linear units or rectified. So this is simply because they didn't estimate the user information correctly. So binning is tricky. I mean, you can actually achieve any value of user information using some arbitrary binning. So you have to know what you're doing when you do binning. And in some sense, I mean, this was actually proven. There are two papers that follow the Saxon out papers that appeared recently. And one of them by a French statistician who actually proved that there is compression in ReLUs analytically using the replica method, if you believe this. Actually, a very complicated paper, but actually supports my claims in that sense at least. And there is another paper by Yuri Polyansky at MIT who also showed that by playing with binning you can get all sorts of wrong estimation of information. But I don't need any of these things because I'm using this Gaussian bound. This is, by the way, here I'm using the fact that this is a neural network because only for a neural network I can write the next layer as a nonlinear function of the weights time the previous layer. And I don't care what this nonlinearity is, if there is compression already inside the nonlinearity, there is compression after the nonlinearity. Now, there are many other claims made by Sachs et al. Which are wrong. I simply don't have the time to argue with everything right now. But you can write to me later and I'll show you what. I think it was an interesting paper, but misleading in many ways. Now, there are other questions. I want to get to one other interesting point. So I already talked about the fact that if this diffusion picture is correct, it gives a new explanation to the benefit of the hidden layer, and this benefit of the hidden layer is always fully computational.
Just quickly, our session is ending in 2 minutes. After that we have a coffee break, so probably some people want to stay and hear a little bit more, but it might be that in 2 minutes people run away, so make it quickly.
I'm out of time, but I'm really happy to see so many people in the room still, and I'm really happy with all the questions, but obviously we didn't get to all the interesting aspects of the problem. So I just want to finish. So first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity and for staying with me for such a poor quality connection. But I'm really excited that you're free to talk about it and to spread the word as much as I can. But I just want to give you just the gist of the new parts of the theory which are not addressed by anyone yet. First of all, okay, so we have an explanation why the hidden layer helps you computationally, and this is again due to the dynamic properties of stochastic gradient descent diffusion. And essentially, the sketch of the proof is here. In order to compress delta S in terms of shifting left to the, I need times this exponential in the compression due to the fact that it comes from the properties of the Fokker-Planck equation of the diffusion process. The entropy grows slowly because the entropy is the log of the standard deviation, and the standard deviation grows like square root of t. Now, when I do this diffusion in parallel between the layers, I get this exponential boost in the compression. Instead of exponent of all those sum of those delta compression between the layers, I move to the maximum of them, and this is in general an exponential factor. Okay, so this is one part of the story. The other part of the story is where are those layers lying eventually? And what you see here is the location of the end location of the layers in similar problem, as a function of the training data size. And you see that they are remarkably stable. I mean, they seem to converge to something which has some regularity. And in order to convince, I want to just give you the gist of the story. So here is a nice Disney simulation of the hidden layers. This is the first hidden layer of the network. And what you see here, just to convince you that the topology of the problem is changing in a very interesting way during the training. So what you see here in black are points which are going to be labeled 1 by the network, and in red those that are going to be labeled -1, so this is a binary problem, and you see that the topology of the layer change in a very interesting way. So during the training, the network is becoming more and more confident of the label. So you see that black becomes more black and red becomes more red. But you also see that in this layer, black and red cannot be separated very easily. Which means there's certainly not a hyperplane or a line that can separate these blacks from the reds. So this is, the topology here is very difficult, which means that the decoder is very complicated. But now to contrast it, let's look at the fourth layer. Again, the same type of two-dimensional nonlinear projection with preserved topology. The fourth layer in this case is going to look very different. And actually what you see very clearly that during the iteration, the red is pushed to the right and the black is pushed to the left. So something in the topology of the problem is changing dramatically between the layers. Actually, you see even another effect here, where the dimensionality of this manifold is getting down from essentially going to be one-dimensional. So these two parts of the story, the red, I call it the dragon's dance. I mean, the red the red points and the black points are completely separated, and actually one line here eventually separates them very nicely. So something very dramatic happened to the organization of the data, and that's what I said already at the beginning. I mean, so that it's not only that I map one layer to the next, I completely changed the topology. I changed what is going to be next. So people which are, and points which are very close by at the beginning are very far away at the lower layers and vice versa. And this is really the secret. I mean, what's going on here? How does it happen? And in order to change topology, you actually need to change, to go through this continuation preserved topology. But so something has to stretch very quickly, very strongly nearby points and pull them in other directions in order to have these topological transitions. And my argument is that these topological transitions can be predicted, from the structure. I need to get out of this movie mode. From the structure of the problem, and this is, I guess, where I'm going to lose most of you. But there's a theory. Once I know that the layers actually lie very close to this optimal information boundary bound, I can calculate the location of the positions which have this continuous transformation to the data. And these are some sort of phase transitions which happens along the bottleneck framework, which essentially amounts to some sort of bifurcations of those representations. And again, without going into detail, what really happens here is that when you move through the information as it appears on the simplex of Y, and you see that when you compress very highly, you get only two clusters or this is when the data is completely separable into two. But when you don't compress enough, you have these bifurcations of phase transitions, which essentially tell you high enough here, you need to answer many binary questions in order to compress the representation. And essentially those bifurcation trees really give you both the structure of the code, I mean, what each layer represents, and also how much you need to compress in order to get to truly separable data. Okay, I know this was too fast, but read the papers. I just want to at least flash the summary to you. So again, first of all, we get the information presentation, which gives you this unique visualization of the problem. We get some very interesting understanding of the advantage of the hidden layers in deep learning. And we have some very interesting insight about the structure of the layers and where those layers are going to be if we know something about the joint distribution of the data or the symmetry of the joint distribution. I think I'll finish by this at this point. Anyway, thank you very much. If you have more questions.
Thank you very much. Most people stayed even if the coffee break already began. I guess if you would answer a couple more questions, some might be interested in asking them. I see 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 hands or so.
Wow.
Let's wait 20 seconds until the people who want to have coffee have left the room. And okay, who was the first?
Thank you. I was not here in the whole talk, but I wanted to ask you. We saw the generalization error always going down, and there was no overfitting happening. I totally get the idea for the classification purposes, but if you do regression, and after some time you start overfitting the training data set, and you do, I mean, what happens there? How can you see these two phases of the dynamics of training? And
All right,
and a follow-up, if the same procedure would allow us to describe recurrent non-networks also. Thank you.
Okay, so these are, sorry, do you hear me?
Yeah.
So these are separate questions. Let me try to answer the first one first. So first of all, there is overfitting. I showed it in one of my slides. Let me try to put it here. So you see that the information Okay, so here it was higher than here in the last layer. This means that if I keep on training, I get less, larger error on my label, which is what you usually call overfitting. So overfitting in my language is overcompression, which means you are trying to reduce, to simplify the partitioning of the data beyond what you can do with the current training data. So there are not enough points in every cluster or in every cell to really guarantee the uniformity of the label. This is overfitting. So I never said that there's no overfitting. Actually, everything that I say is true for regression, as it's true for multi-valued label or whatever it is. The only thing that is important here is that the Y is simpler in some sense than X, but even this can be fixed if you want, and we can talk about autoencoders and guns and whatever you want. Now, the other question is, well, recurrent networks are very different in principle, but what most people do with recurrent networks is that they take snapshots in different times and see so the Markov chain is looking at all the units together in different times, and this is obviously a Markov chain, and this decay of information across time is analogous and fully exactly the same correspondence as the decay of information across layers in my story. This is a very interesting research topic, how exactly we can extend this to recurrent networks. We haven't done it yet, but I know that a lot of people are thinking about it.
Thank you very much. More questions? Yeah.
Thank you. This conclusion that number of layers helps, it reminds me a bit of the work of Tony Podge and Lorenzo Rosasco, but also in the last year I think that a lot of people have came to the same conclusion from different fields. For example, Ankit Patel from graphical models or Helmut Bolske from harmonic analysis. Do you see some chance of unifying all these theories of deep learning?
Well, first of all, okay, it's good that we have a lot of theories of deep learning. This is an exciting area, an exciting time, because just a couple of years ago we didn't have any good theory. By the way, within these theories there are all sorts of small differences. I mean, for example, what Tony Poggio is saying is related to what I say about the convergence to Gibbs near flat minima. In that sense, it's essentially the same story, but I don't think that he has all the story about the dynamics of the diffusion and the way it is related to the time that it takes to converge. He may be saying it now, but last year it wasn't there. On the other hand, let's say if you look at the work of Ricardo Zecchina, for example, on deep learning, they studied a lot the properties of this equilibrium state, and they argue that it's not Gibbs, it's something different from Gibbs. This is actually compatible with what I'm saying. I'm also saying that each layer is actually in a different temperature. So, and if you look at the work came from France just last week or 2 weeks ago from this statistical physicist in France who analyzed these information properties in layers, actually say things which are completely mind-boggling in many ways on very different networks that they, and partly completely agree with me, partly say that it's more complicated than I claim. I think that it's a very exciting time to be in this field. Eventually I hope that one theory will come out of it, or at least some stories which are in full agreement with each other. But I look at it through these eyes of typical large problems in information theory. I think it gives you some sort of perspective which you don't see in other views, but eventually, yes, we are all looking at the same elephant in different parts of it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. There was the last question, two questions. I think I saw you hand.
I would like to ask if it's possible to apply this knowledge to highlight the parts of the image or features of the image that are important for the network to make the decision to classify the image into a certain class?
Yes, okay, so that's again a good question, which in general is how can we use this understanding to improve our algorithms and do better jobs. in terms of deep learning. So I completely agree that that's what we want to do at the end, but I argue that we first need to understand what's going on, and only after we understand we can improve the algorithms. So in general, we're still at the early phase of trying to understand what's going on. But I can already tell you that out of this understanding seem to be several hints in better algorithms. For example, just use the fact that I'm actually converging to this information theoretic bound, and there are some algorithms for calculating the points. So near this bound, there's some sort of an EM-like algorithm, or what we call the Arimoto Blout, or the alternating projection algorithm, which connect the encoder and the decoder. So essentially I'm saying that what the network should do is some sort of alternation between the encoder and the decoder, which puts you into this bound. This is not implemented today in the deep learning community at all. I mean, the gradient descent is not taking this into account. And I believe that combining these two things can have I claim to have a much better understanding of problems which have symmetries. And symmetries, I mean that there is some sort of invariant transformation that keep the label invariant, like rotations, translation, and things like this. Convolution neural networks are very closely related to this and to symmetries. But we have now much better understanding of the symmetries, which will tell you which feature is encoded in each layer, and if I'm right about those phase transition things, then each layer is going to get converged to a point where the topology is changing. And where the topologies are changing depend on your understanding of the problem, which you can sometimes say just by knowing some general properties of the problem. For example, face recognition or medical data analysis, or many other problems where you have a lot of side information and a lot of background about the structure and symmetries. And those can help you both in the design, in terms of how many layers are optimal, and in terms of the understanding of what the layer really represents. But this is just the beginning of a very rich story. Maybe next year we'll be able to say much more.
Okay, thank you. But I didn't just mean for building better architectures, but also to gain the trust and to be more confident to
Okay,
build this
yes,
black
yes.
box. So
Yes, that's a very important question.
More for experience.
So for example, that's obviously what we want at the end is guarantees that these networks are not going to surprise us by giving very big errors or by killing people in autonomous cars or whatever. And this is obviously an important question. We need guarantees on out of training error, which are much better. Now, for example, last year there were all those examples where you can actually cheat, adversarially cheat a neural network by modifying some strange parameters, some parameters which humans immediately see that nothing happened, but the neural network was confused. Now, this type of things can be understood much better when you understand what I said about irrelevant and relevant dimensions. For example, increase the variability of the training data, either by collecting more data or by artificially distorting it in all sorts of dimensions, is going to protect you, according to my diffusion process, in more dimensions. And therefore, those dimensions in which you could distort the image and get wrong results are essentially dimensions where this diffusion or ignoring this irrelevant dimension didn't work. So the mechanism I described is giving you a direct understanding how it could happen that changing the image in one dimension that you could perceive and completely destroy the recognition. And once you understand how it could happen, you already have half of the solution. So again, we're not yet there, but this type of understanding is eventually going to lead to exactly what you want, which are provable guarantees of performance. Everybody wants that. All right, I really believe that we are more or less exhausted. I'm exhausting your patience at this point. If there are more people who want, I still see a lot of people in the room. So
There's one last question, I think, and then I need to grant the people a coffee.
Yeah, right. I also need to go.
Yeah. So I have one last question, which is kind of related to the question before, and I was thinking about maybe not exact decision boundaries, which is kind of a holy grail, but when you look at the relevant and irrelevant dimensions of the input, can you or have you tried to find some kind of measure of how far away you are from a decision boundary or something like that?
Yeah, okay, so you're talking in a slightly different... You're absolutely right that the relevant dimensions are very closely related to the issue of margin and decision boundaries. So essentially, there is a close relationship between how many relevant dimensions are there and how many support vectors are needed in some sense. I mean, which is related to the dimensionality, the local low dimensionality of the problem. So again, if you want a more intuitive picture, you saw it in this two-dimensional embedding that I showed you. The story is that you have a high-dimensional problem, but locally low dimension. There is a locally low dimensional manifold which is folded in a very crazy way in this high-dimensional space of the widths. Now, if it wasn't low-dimensional locally, you couldn't learn. So that everything depends on this ability to separate this locally low-dimensional relevant manifolds from the high-dimensional irrelevant. But what we see from this analysis is that okay, so the width of the low-dimensional manifold is really directly related to the margin in the problems in classical SVM or whatever. I mean the margin problem. So you know that generalization can be thought as extending the margin of the boundary. But I actually argue that there is a new story here, and the new story happens in the irrelevant dimensions, which means how much of those irrelevant dimensions I'm able to eventually ignore. This is not something which we clearly discussed in learning theory before. And what I argue is that this second phase of this diffusion process of the deep learning is working in this high-dimensional, low, irrelevant manifold. Now, by the way, so it means that if you truncate the weights too early, for example, something which we always thought is a good idea because you want to sparsify the network and you want to reduce the VC dimension and things like this, this is actually a bad idea if you believe this diffusion story, because this is going to slow down the diffusion. You're just going to cut paths that can be ignored eventually by so for example, there are many papers, especially some that came from Google recently, that argue that you can train a network with very high dimension and then eventually sparsify it or cut 90% of the weights, and it's not going to hurt your performance significantly. Because most of the weights are used only during the training. They really open the venue for this diffusion to work, but eventually it's not like scaffolding. I mean, once you got there, you don't need anything. So most of the parameters of the network really help you to diffuse, to move from place to place in a good place. But once you got to a good place, they are not effective. In another way of saying it is that most of these weights open this venue for the optimization, but they are irrelevant with respect to the support vectors of the problem. So again, I'm not sure I'm directly answering your question about the margin, about the boundaries. You see, the boundaries, you increase the margin, or when you add noise to the problem and make yourself robust to noise. So there's a very close relationship between my story and all these arguments about sensitivity and robustness, which are related to compression and related to expanding the margin and related to stability. But I think we are out of time for today.
I think you gave us a lot of food for thought and maybe more. We thank you a lot for your time, and under these circumstances, thank you.
All right. So again, thank you for allowing me to do it, despite the fact that Swiss didn't take me from Israel. But next time I hope to be there.
When will be the next time you will discuss this? Like, I don't know, on a conference or have a paper or book on it? Yeah.
Well, you know, today the papers are all on YouTube. So anytime you give a paper, you give a talk, everybody hears it. So you have to say something new in every talk. I'm actually going to be in Berlin for another meeting, another MI something a data science meeting in Berlin at the end of June.
Okay.
This is the next time that I know, but
Good.
there are quite a few other occasions. I'm going to be in France in August and then in September again in England in ECML, in Dublin actually. I'm going to give a tutorial. So I don't know, and I'm trying to say something new every time I speak because I know that everybody follows or some people are following my YouTube talks. Anyway, it was really very exciting to talk to you this way, and I'm glad that some of you find it interesting.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much.
Yeah.
And for the audience, you still have time to grab a coffee and a cake and be on time for the next session. Thank you.
Yeah. Enjoy your coffee. So thank you very much.